And I want to make a nod, give a nod out to all the other really wonderful women's outreach programs in Iowa. None of us do this in isolation. There's Women, Land, and Legacy, which has a very nice long history of doing outreach to women landowners. And there are women in ag programs in Iowa that are there. I know up in Northwest Iowa, there's been a Women in Overalls, Women in Denim, you know, so there are a number of really high quality women's outreach programs. So I want to put a plug in for all of those because it's a great place for you to hone your knowledge and find out what you can do when you get a mind to doing something. So last time I talked a little bit more about the timing of things, and I want to emphasize that everything takes a year in agriculture. If you're going to change a lease, you're going to change some of those things. So the timing of when you do those things is super important. And we can touch more on that later, but what I want to talk about today is more about three main points. And this is a message that has come through loud and clear from all the other women landowners that I've spoken to. They say, it's your land. Sometimes they'll slap the top of the table and say, honey, it's your land, when they're sharing in a circle. And we'll talk a little bit about what you need to know. And then we'll talk about what makes those conversations so hard. Why are they hard? You know, what is it? And there may be some things that you know very well and some things that you might find interesting and useful. And then some strategies for some easier conversations. And this is advice from a variety of people. I have farm with a tenant, and we have a great relationship. So I will share with you things that other people have done that are certainly important and useful. So here's that slap on the table. It's your land. And if you're not happy with the water quality in Iowa, with the soil quality, with the variety of things going on, if you're concerned about climate change, if you're concerned about, food production, real food, organic production, doesn't matter. It's your responsibility. It's your land. And you need to have some knowledge about some things. So it's your responsibility, even if you think you don't know a lot, even if you are treated like you don't get to decide. And I've talked to plenty of women who say, well, I don't get, they never asked me. And the other ladies have said, don't apologize for what you want. Think about it, make reasonable requests, but don't apologize. It's okay. So here's a couple of things that I think are really important. It doesn't matter whether you live on the land or if you live far away from the land. It's still your responsibility to find things out. What's happening downstream? Find out where your land is. Where does the water go when it leaves your land? How are you part of a watershed? Where is it going? And then look downstream, drive around a little bit, take a look and see what's going on. I'm kind of curious about this. You can almost see a curve in that soil there. Certainly this cut bank is a problem where that water is coming around the curve and cuts into soil and sediment. That means that there's water going too fast, too much water too fast. So is some of that water that's going too fast coming from your land? Think about those things. If you're an up watershed neighbor, there may be some things that you need to know about what can be done, and learn to read some of those curves in that soil. Makes me suspicious that that was originally the land surface, and that maybe everything above that, the overburden there, had come washing down from 160 years of agriculture that came washing down and settled in there. We see that sometimes on the rivers in Iowa, where a lot of what we see as the topsoil has come off the hills elsewhere. So it's also your responsibility to find out what's coming on to your land, what's happening to you, where's water coming in. If this is coming in on your land, you can be sure that the neighbor is looking at that and tilling through it, and you're not going to see it. But sure enough, that's a sign you've got water coming in on you that's carrying sediment, and it's going to start gathering some speed and momentum and can be a problem. So really examine what's coming into you. It's also your responsibility to think about what's leaving your land. Are you losing a lot of soil through something that's broken? You need to find these things out. Yeah, you may have some mobility problems. Maybe you've got, distance and time, etc. You need to find somebody trusted to help you because it is your responsibility. But we have a lot of historic reasons why this is hard. These are hard conversations. There's a lot of stuff that's baked into our social structure. There's a lot of check wires on our whole system and the communication. So why is it so hard for some of us? Here's what I will share that comes from the research from sociolinguists and other research. So let's look at ourselves first. This is some of what makes that conversation hard. If this is a population distribution curve, it doesn't matter what this bottom is necessarily, but let's pretend that this was an assessment of risk. And are you a risk taker? Do you like to be out in front and see what's going on and help some things change on the landscape? Or are you maybe, I want to see somebody else do it first and might be further along? Or are you on the back side of that curve? Not going to make any big changes. Not going to make any big changes. Then you also have to think about where your tenant is. Is your farmer somebody who's out there in front, likes to experiment, likes to see what's going on? Or is your tenant somebody who is a little bit eager, but really want to see what's going on? Are they somebody that'll go to a field day and say, yeah, I think we might be able to try that if they're encouraged? Or are they in the backside of that curve? I'd do it only if I have to and I get some help and whatever. Or are they part of this ain't never going to do it, no how, no way, forget it? So you'll have to think about where you are. I'll back up again. Where are you in terms of what you're willing to do, and where is your farmer? Those all play an important role. Then here's probably the key to those gendered conversations that I think are really interesting. Deborah Tannen is a sociolinguist from Georgetown University. She did some books in the 90s. We all laugh about men never asking for directions. That came out of her work back in the 1990s. And she's done extensive work on conversations. Now, this horizontal and vertical talk is my adaptation. So you're not going to find that in her work. But she started this out by examining the talk of children and see how we're socialized. So 4 little preschool boys talking and just playing very normally. The first one says, I can throw a ball up to here. And the second one says, I can throw a ball up to here, meaning a little higher. The third little boy, they're jostling and laughing and kicking around. And third little boy says, I can throw a ball up to the sky. And they think that's pretty funny. It's just a normal thing. And the fourth little boy kind of sits back and he says, I can throw a ball up to God. And they laugh, and there's nothing wrong with that conversation. Very normal, very natural. But you'll notice how there's a vertical nature to that. There's kind of one-upmanship. There's sometimes implicit put downs. It's establishing independence. It's establishing authority. And so that's just a very natural, normal way that we also see adult men will talk with each other, and it's very normal. They're very comfortable in that role. 2 little girls were coloring, and the one little girl looks up and says, my babysitter called Amber has already contacts. I've repeated the syntax, and that's contacts for the eye. Okay, and the other little girl is coloring, and she looks up and says, my mommy and daddy have already contacts too. And the first little girl looks up and just beams and says, same, same. You see how they're drawing that horizontal nature. There's a sameness there that they're celebrating because they're celebrating the relationship. Who knows if the mommy and daddy had contacts or not? It didn't matter. You know, it was there. They were drawing that relationship sameness. So the relationships are super important, but our purposes of our talk, our conversation purposes can be a little bit different, and that can make a challenge. So when we're asking questions, we're just asking questions. It's an opening for a discussion, everybody's ideas. You know, you just kind of lob something out there and you assume that women are going to jump in and say what they think. It's also an effort to practice concepts. So I might want to say, well, you know, I think I need to plant cover crops, but a winter kill cover crop, you know, and so it's a chance we'll ask questions to practice concepts. And so our purpose for our questions are a little bit different. We are also interested in information gathering, and it doesn't mean that men don't do this too. It just is a little bit different where we're asking for information that verifies or conflicts with others. So we kind of go about that investigation in a particular way. It's kind of the Annie's list sort of concept where we're trying to find who's good, who's doing a good job, or is that really a crazy idea and we shouldn't be going down that path. So we're really looking for those kinds of nuanced pieces. Well, no surprise. When we're asking questions, it sounds different to him. You sound unsure. You sound tentative. So if you're asking, well, what do you think about this stuff? He's not sure that you're even really serious, that you've made up your mind. It may not be a serious request. And if it isn't a serious request and it's easy to push off, that can be why you may not be getting responses from a tenant that may not be saying yes to what you're after. And you certainly can sound like you don't know as much as you probably do. Run into that an awful lot where, it just, you just come off like you really are kind of diminutive and not very, very smart about some of those things. And it can also be that it sounds like you're challenging them. We recently worked with a woman landowner who said, gosh, it took a while for him to figure out that when I was asking questions, it wasn't because I thought he was doing a bad job. I just wanted to know what he was doing. I was just trying to learn, but he was reacting like, why are you asking me all these questions? He was seeing them as a bad thing. And the other thing that happens, and oh Lord, we've seen this in meetings and in emails and all that kind of stuff. Women will write an email and will say, oh, I've got this team meeting we've got to do. We've got to accomplish these kind of things. I think we should probably do X, Y, Z. What do you think? And then we send the email out. And sometimes if there's men on there, that's crickets because they're reluctant to come out with that first, because that vertical nature who's going to lob grenades at you for making that decision. And maybe you're not really ready to make that decision right now. And so that question causes just a little bit of panic because I don't think I want to say yes or no to relay cropping because I haven't thought it all the way through, but our questions come across as if they have to make a decision right now, and that has to be very definitive. So that can make it really, really tricky. With women, we're balancing relationships all at once, everything all at once. We're balancing who's his mother is that we go to church with. We're balancing who maybe his aunt is that we're in bridge circle with or something like that. We're balancing a lot of relationships. Maybe we're balancing relationships with the seed store or a variety of places. So there's a huge amount of balancing that we're doing all the time because, again, that relationship piece is super important, and absence of conflict makes our world go a lot easier. Process versus product. Women are interested in getting credit for the effort that we put in to make something happen. The weird thing that happens with leasing is that we're forced into looking at only the products because it gets down to dollars, cents, and acres. And that's where men are very comfortable. That's really, you know, they're about the goal, winning the game, getting the task done to the exclusion of everything else. They're going to get that task done. And we're still juggling all of these things, trying to multitask because we're good at it. And that process is something that we're focused on, and they may be really strictly focused on the product. And again, it goes back to that vertical nature of their normal, natural, comfortable talk. And it tends to be a lot more competitive than collaborative. And because we're focused on the relationships, we're a lot more inclined to look at things collaboratively. We'll talk about having a partnership or a stewardship partnership or a collaboration with our tenant. So let's quickly go to some strategies for improving those conversations. I'll give a nod to Tammy Deal, who uses these questions. I just think they're fabulous because they're lower risk. And these are the conversations that she'll have with her tenant. And she'll say, what needs to be done to improve the farm? And this is the perfect time. End of August, you know, we're gonna make changes. We're gonna have these conversations. How should we prioritize improvements? The we in there puts you in there as a partner. How do we budget for these improvements? She's managing in a different style, but you can ask that question even if you're under a cash rent situation. And I love the last one. This is a new one that she's kind of crystallized and says, what is something new you would like to try? Because Tammy is interested in supporting new practices, making improvements steadily. Then slightly more assertive questions. Teach yourself how to do the slate test. If you need some help, find any agronomist, they'll help you do the slate test. And this, I think, is another thing. You don't have to have all the answers on how to fix all this stuff. But if you can do the slate test where you see the soil dissolving and it's a disaster and you've got some soil that's behaving a lot better, all you need to be able to do is say, I know this is wrong. I want my soil to be more like that, the better condition. How do we fix that? What's my responsibility? What's your responsibility? You don't have to have all the answers, but you can work in a partnership there. It's a little more assertive because it's a little hard to argue with the soil dissolving in the jar. You may need extra authority. Get that lease in writing. Make sure you have a lease in writing. It protects your tenant, protects you, protects your tenant. Molly is much better at talking at that. But you may want to work with another advisor. Maybe you need to call in the banker. Maybe you've got an insurance agent that can sit down with him. That may give you a little extra edge. Hire a farm manager. Now, you can hire them for consultation. You can just say, I need help with this thing and pay them for that thing. You don't have to have them fully engaged, but maybe push comes to shove. Maybe you need to hire a farm manager. So I'm coming close to wrapping up here, and I want to say this is what we hear so often from other women. When they come to a women's meeting and it's a safe space for them to practice the language, practice the terminology, learn the concepts, ask the questions that they'll never in fact ask in front of a man, it has nothing to do with a variety of things you might think it does. They just need a safe space to practice. So they come to learn what they can to contribute to conversations. If you don't know, you don't have a voice. They're not going to treat you like you know. So here's my unabashed, shameless plug. I'm going to start some new services through my e-resources group business. I've been playing around with some things that may be helpful for women who live far away from their land and they need another kind of advisor out there. So I'm not quite ready to launch those and say exactly what they'll be yet, but I'm out there. I'm going to do something to help continue down this path. I'm not retiring. I'm not quitting working with Women Food and Ag Network or any of the other partners. I'm just adding something because I think I can. So that's my story, and I think I'm on time. Oh.
Thanks, Jean. Ruth, you want to fire your stuff up?
Yes, I will. And first of all, I just want to ask, can everybody hear me all right? I'm in a basement room where there's like constant airflow. So just somebody give me a thumbs up.
You sound good. You're clear.
Fantastic. Yep. All right, let me share my screen and get my thing fired up here, full screen mode. All right, can everybody see that? Does it look like a full screen? Sweet. All right. Jean, fantastic. I always love listening to your perspectives on these topics. And I know that I see in my work a lot of parallels with those communication styles, especially. Somebody in the chat box made the comment that, well, hashtag, it's not like this for everybody. And I totally agree with that. Of course, communication differs for people. Some people are better communicators than others, absolutely. But I do want to support what Jean is saying, in that I have definitely seen those generalities as well. So in practice. Anyway, so let's launch into my bit here. This will be fast, but I'm happy to share this PowerPoint, the slide set with anybody that wants it. So my email's at the end, and you can email me and I'm happy to send it to you because there's some good information in here. I put it together myself. So my name is Ruth McCabe, and I am a conservation agronomist with Heartland Cooperative, and I'm one of the people that was working behind the scenes to plan this workshop series. I'm a certified crop advisor. I'm also a certified professional agronomist. That's what those fancy letters after my name mean. I throw them on there to make myself feel good about all those years that I spent grueling away. But we'll get launched into talking about conservation agronomy, which is what we're here to chat about real briefly today. So what's my role? I'll keep this brief. I wear a lot of hats at Heartland, as does anybody that works in conservation. And so I have three main hats that I wear, which is that I work directly with growers to change their management plans to incorporate conservation practices into those management plans. I also work with growers and their agronomists. That's that snowy picture at the bottom there. That's a grower and his agronomist. And I work with them as teams to help provide education or to help get everybody on board with programs that are being implemented. And then last but not least, I build a lot of these public-private partnerships at like the larger state level or regional level to help launch larger conservation programs and get that out there, like this non-operating landowner workshop series that we're in right now. So this is the conservation team at Heartland. Look at all of our smiling faces. Heartland's conservation agronomy program launched last summer, so it's a baby. It's fresh out of the box for a year, and I'm one of three people that are working to develop it. But we're already getting it off the ground and doing a lot in our first year. And so I just wanted to show y'all our smiling faces, mainly because the next few slides are just a bunch of words, so they're a little boring. I wanted everyone to have some pictures to enjoy. All right. So before we get started chatting about conservation agriculture and what that looks like and what those practices look like, I wanted to define a few terms because I think sometimes if you're not really closely working in the field of agriculture, I love that pun, by the way, but if you're not really working in this field, you might not know the difference between these three terms. So we're going to define them. So first, there's conventional agriculture. You'll hear this phrase. People will say, oh, well, she's a conventional farmer, or he farms conventionally. You might hear people say that. What does that mean? What that traditionally, or I should say what that has come to mean, is that that farmer uses chemicals to control their weeds and their pests. They might use inorganic forms of fertilizer like urea or anhydrous ammonia, but that doesn't mean that they don't use conservation. There are plenty of conventional growers who use conservation practices, right? And then you'll hear the term organic agriculture, right? Like, oh, well, he farms organically, or she's an organic farmer, or they're certified organic. And what that means is that that farmer does not use any unapproved, non-organic certified substance to control their weeds or pests. And They do not use inorganic forms of fertilizer. And they may use conservation agriculture practices, but they might not. And I used to work as an organic agronomist before I switched over to the conventional side of things. And I'll tell you, I'd say that there are fantastic conventional farmers using conservation practices, and there are a lot of organic farmers that are not using conservation practices, and then there's a lot that are. So don't confuse the two. And that brings me to my final point, which is, what's conservation agriculture? And conservation agriculture is, it doesn't really matter if you're farming organically or conventionally. You're using practices that reduce the loss of soil or nutrients from your fields. You're improving your soil health of your field. And these are practices, like I said, that are independent of whether a farmer uses chemicals or inorganic types of fertilizers. So get my definition of conservation agriculture, and there are a million definitions for this phrase out there, but my definition is farming practices that allow a farm field to provide some level of ecosystem services back to the environment, while also still enabling us to farm that field. So when we plowed up fields, prairies and wetlands and put in tiling 200 years ago, at the time, we didn't really understand that we were removing very valuable ecosystem services from our environment, right? Now, fast forward 200 years, we realize, oh golly, being able to keep nutrients out of our streams is really important. Or, oh geez, flooding and sediment, filling all of our ponds and lakes with sediment really isn't good. We need to get some ways back into the environment to stop that stuff from happening. So that's what conservation agricultural practices seek to do. So I look at conservation agriculture as a suite of practices. These are a bunch of pictures of different topics, different types of conservation practices, and we'll delve into some of these. But I wanted to interrupt all the words with some more pictures because I like pictures. And these are all different practices that can be employed on the field level that can provide some kind of ecosystem service back to the environment. So I look at them as, like I said, a suite of practices, and I see them as something like investing, right? So in investing, if you go to an investment advisor, they're going to figure out what your level of risk is, right? So there are some conservation practices that have very low risk. They're easy to employ, but they also have relatively low reward on the conservation spectrum. They do a little bit, they don't do a lot, but it's still something. I look at that as like nitrogen stabilizers, putting down a nitrogen stabilizer in the fall if you're going to put fertilizer in the fall, so that maybe you don't lose as much, right, to spring runoff. Or just waiting to apply your fertilizer in the spring. If you can do that and you have the soil types that allow that, that's a conservation practice. Low risk, good reward, right, depending on your soil types. And as we move down that list, you get into the more riskier practices that have greater rewards, right, at the landscape level, all the way down to wetlands, which is fantastic for the environment, but not so great if you want to farm that field, right? So I have a few slides that go over some of these practices a little more in depth, so we'll talk about them right now. Nutrient control is one area of conservation agriculture or conservation practices, right? Where if you think about it, these are all things that are related to nutrient control. And the idea here is keeping these nutrients out of our waterways and keeping them in our field, or conserving them, right, in the field. So things like nitrogen stabilizers, we're doing variable rate nutrient application. So instead of dumping the same amount of fertilizer across all your acres, you do some soil tests, you get a good feel for what each acre needs, and then that's the total amount that you apply on that particular area of the field. So you might not be putting as much in some areas, when that can overall reduce how much you're putting on. Then there's things like spring nitrogen, putting it on in the spring, waiting. This can't always be done. It depends on the soil types, but if you can apply it in the spring, you're reducing your risk of losing it to your streams with snow melt or spring rains. We've also got in-season nitrogen applications, spoon feeding nitrogen throughout the season as the corn is growing or whatever. And the idea here is you're reducing risk of losing that nitrogen because you're putting it on when the plant needs it. And also things like, keeping the cows out of the stream, putting up a watering system and putting up a fence that prevents the cows from wandering into the stream and defecating and urinating in the water, right? Things like that. Then we have something a little more risk. There are these up and coming, very popular right now, edge of field structures. These are known as saturated buffers or bioreactors. Not the same as a grass buffer strip. A saturated buffer goes underneath a grass buffer strip next to a stream, for instance. And this picture here, you can see basically what these saturated buffers or bioreactors do is they collect the water that's moving off of a field, and before that water goes into the stream, where the tile outlet enters into the stream, that water moves through some sort of, it either moves through soil, or maybe it moves through a pit of wood chips in the case of bioreactor, and that water is denitrified. The nitrogen is removed from that water before it reaches the stream. So these ideally go on the edge of a field. They don't take land out of production. There's a little bit of risk because you got to install them and they're expensive, but they have higher rewards. Then we get to cover cropping. So everybody talks about cover cropping like it's so easy and it's low risk and high rewards. And I would argue cover crops are great. I love cover crops. They are not 100% low risk, not at all. They can definitely complicate a management system, especially if you've never done it before, you know, or you're not a no-tiller or whatever. But they're still really valuable and they fall in the middle of that like risk range, in my opinion. And cover crops are nice because they act as, you know, slow release fertilizers. They hold nutrients in the field. You don't lose them to the stream. And in the case of that upper, I don't know if it's upper left or upper right for you guys, but that picture of those soybeans poking through that rye mat, a lot of folks strive for something that looks like that, right? Because they can also control weeds if done right. Then there's no-till and strip-till. You'll hear those terms used a lot. No-till and strip-till is just farmers using specialized planting equipment that allows them to cut through trash that's left on the soil surface, and they don't till that stuff in. In the case of no-till, they absolutely don't till it in, right? The last year's corn stover, last year's bean stalks, I just call it trash, are just left on the soil surface, and you cut through it with something called a no-till planter to plant your next season's crop into it. And by doing that, you're not disturbing the soil. You're not ripping up all of those fungal and bacterial bonds that are in the soil. You're disturbing the soil a lot less. And no-till and strip-till are fantastic for soil health. And you know, they help build organic matter over time. But they do require an investment, sometimes significantly. Either you're retrofitting your planter. You know, it's not just, you don't just sell your tillage equipment and now you're no-till. You have to retrofit your planter, you got to retrofit your drill, or you got to buy a new planter or a new drill. There's a financial investment to turning to this practice system. And also, let's be clear, to adopt no-till, strip-till, yields will be suppressed for the first few years as the soil kind of, so to speak, warms up to this new type of management. And that's pretty common from what I've seen. Then you get into the more high risk but greater rewards, establishing things like contour buffer strips and filter strips. I stole this picture blatantly from the NRCS because I love it. It's a great picture. But it's this idea of putting certain, you know, grass strips or perennial grass strips back in the landscape to filter and catch that water, for instance, as it's moving off the field, or to catch that soil before it leaves the field and goes downstream. And then you get to wetlands, right? This is super risky, but absolutely fantastic for the environment. You know, you might have a field where there's a very low portion of that field. There's 20 or 30 acres of that field that every year it drowns out consistently. And every year you just have problems with it. And there's no amount of tiling that's going to fix it. Maybe the rest of your farms, maybe you have 160 acres, maybe the rest of your farm's return on investment, or ROI as we call it, could be raised if you just took that 20 acres out of production and you put it in a prairie pothole or some kind of wetland structure. Because then maybe the rest of the acres around that wetland structure could actually start to produce decently again. So something to think about, right? I'll just briefly give a nod to, sometimes I have folks ask me about carbon credits and carbon credit programs. This is a conversation for another time. I actually did a presentation on carbon programs for women, land, and legacy, and I can get access to that link. So my email here is at the end. Just shoot me an email if you would like to see that presentation that I did on carbon programs. It's about an hour long, maybe hour and a half, but it's got a ton of information in it about carbon programs and how they can fit into the conservation conversation. I love saying those two words together. Last but not least, I have a slide in here that talks about Heartland's conservation approach, and I would encourage all the landowners in this workshop to think about this as your conservation approach. So as you go forward and you're working with your landowners to adopt conservation practices, I would encourage you to think about conservation like this, which is that not every practice, not every conservation practice fits on every acre, but there is at least one conservation practice that will work for every acre. So not every practice for every acre, but there is a practice for every acre. The other thing is you can improve, and I would encourage you to focus on improving an operation field by field rather than a blanket approach. The top down, this should apply to all our fields approach might not fly very well and it might not work very well. So going field by field is a better way to approach conservation. And we already talked about how conservation is like investment portfolio. Think about your long-term land and legacy goals, what your risk tolerance is, what your timeline is, how quickly do you need to turn this thing around, and then what state or federal programs can you take advantage of, what private programs, right? So exhaust your resources. And I know that was fast and furious, drinking from the fire hose, but I hope it was helpful. Again, thanks everybody. I hope that provides some context. My email is rmccabe@heartlandcoop.com, and please reach out to me with additional questions that you might have. And I know there are questions in the chat because it's just been firing nonstop. Either that means I was really good or really bad, but we'll address some of those in the roundtable discussion.
Great, thank you, Ruth.
Yeah.
And then somebody asked in the chat a little while ago about if there was a Facebook group specifically for women landowners with tenants in the Midwest who have tenants, and they were wondering, Carrie was wondering if people were interested in that type of thing. So that's a great point to bring up, and I think that you all, if that's something of interest, like speak up in the chat. But also Jean has offered to stay in touch with anybody through email that wants some more resources. So if you've already asked to be put on an email list in a previous workshop, you don't necessarily need to put your name out there again now. But if you do want to keep in contact with Jean, go ahead and let us know in the chat box or send a direct message, and we'll make sure to get your name on a list for follow up. All right, and then why don't we go ahead and we'll continue on and then circle back to some of these other specific questions after Molly gives her presentation.
Hi, everybody. Can you hear me okay? Can you see my screen? Great. A lot of familiar faces here that we've seen in the other webinar that we've had over the last month. So thank you for continuing to come back. And it just means a lot to the whole group that's been putting this together to see a good response to these webinars. I'm Molly Aronowitz. I am a farm manager with People's Company. I live in Ames and manage farms in central Iowa. Today I am in Florida, finishing a little family vacation on the beach before my kids go back to school. So I'm glad to be here with you all. I'm going on my 9th year managing farms with People's Company. I grew up on a farm in Northeast Iowa. Spent a lot of time following my dad around the farm, and then kind of followed the same path, beginning to manage farms as he was a farm manager. And I've had a real cool opportunity to see kind of both sides of the landowner perspective and the farmer perspective. And a handful of the slides we're going to go through today are a repeat, kind of revisiting the ideas of our last webinar. But my hope is that it'll set the stage for a deeper, more specific conversation in our Q&A, and please ask. I'm really anxious to hear the questions you have and the conversation we have after we finish up today. I love what Jean said about implementing change takes time. It could take a year, and that's always in the back of my head. And I think the timing of our webinar series and finishing today wasn't by accident. As we think about opportunities to bring change to our farms, that the the clock always kind of starts fresh in my mind September 1st. And it's all because we're implementing change around a written lease in my world. And so I want to say, make that reminder now so I don't forget it later. If you're in Iowa, if you have an Iowa farm lease, that lease cancellation deadline is September 1st. And that's what I've been spending all my time on this last month, of having that conversation with landowners, with farmers, having that conversation of, are we going to cancel that lease? And if we cancel it, it doesn't mean that I don't want to work with that farmer in the coming year. It only means that that is our signal that a change is going to be made in our written farm lease. And I think both parties should respect that written contract and use it as a tool, you know, almost like insurance. Use it as a tool to protect you as the landowner, and the tenant should feel that it protects them also. And if anything would happen to either party, there is a written documentation of that partnership for the person to come in behind and continue that partnership. If you do not have a written lease, I'd encourage you to consider a written lease. If you have just a verbal agreement, that still has to be canceled by September 1st. That is written and verbal agreements for that lease cancellation. And, you know, you could reach out to, you know, a manager or a consultant to help you to craft a written lease. You could also, great resource online with I think if you just Googled Iowa farm lease or Iowa state farm lease, you know, a real nice template would pop up for you to use as a starting point through Iowa state farm lease. So like I said, goal today is to run through the slides from last week and set the stage, and really looking forward to answering more specific questions during our Q&A. So choosing an appropriate lease is a vital step in managing a farm as a non-farming landowner. And each type of lease reflects a different set of priorities and different opportunities. And like what we talked about last week, the type of lease, I consider the financial risk associated with each type of lease. And when I think about financial risk, I think about the skin I have to put in to play. So with the cash rent lease, you know, as a landowner, I'm not putting much in. So the financial risk is low. As we move up the pyramid, from cash lease to flexible to crop share and custom, I think the most risk is in the custom farming, simply because we're putting the most in. And so the level of involvement you can dedicate to the management, dictates the type of lease, your cash flow, and then finally, that level of trust you may have with your tenant or contractor will also, you know, help you decide what kind of farm lease to have. So let's run through those four types of leases again real quick. So with a custom farming agreement, the landowner assumes all the expenses and takes the full crop at harvest. The landowner hires an operator or a local co-op to perform the various farming tasks throughout the season. This is fertilizer, planting, spraying, harvest, and handling that grain. What's really rewarding about a custom farming agreement is that the landowner gets to make all of the decisions And you really have the opportunity to adopt change faster, I would say. You know, this can feel overwhelming to a non-farming landowner. But the good news is that there's many advisors ready at the ready to help you make decisions. Everything from choosing seed, fertilizer, chemical, how to market how to market that grain. With a little work, a landowner can put together a trusted team of advisors. Or, you know, on the other hand, hire someone like a farm manager or farm consultant to help you get started, or just for continual use. You know, I think that the main takeaway here is that there's resources and people available to help you navigate this alone, or you can hire the help that you need. On a crop share lease, this is right behind custom farming, where instead of the landowner putting 100% in, they are sharing expense and all income with their tenant. It's typically a 50-50 percentage makeup, but depending where you are in the state, and maybe some different aspects of your farm, it's not uncommon to see a 30-70 or a 60-40. The landowner still has significant control over production decisions, but they can have a really good partner in their farmer where they have shared goals and there is place for conversation, some back and forth on decision making. A flex lease is where an annual base rent is set, and then a year-end bonus is paid if yield or price hit a predetermined number as set forth in the lease. This is an easy way to set a lease that can run year to year. So when prices go up, the landowner benefits. When prices are low, the tenant is not overpaying rent. You know, the one sticky spot that, you know, if would typically come up first thing and when I'm talking through the idea of a flex lease with the tenant is, you know, if prices go low, does rent go down? No. In the flex lease that I use, that, you know, majority of landowners use, there isn't that that base rent going down. So that should be part of the conversation as you set base rent, and maybe you consider, you know, if crop insurance is part of the conversation, where's that floor that crop insurance provides. But, you know, that is a critique of a flex lease. The challenge is finding the right formula in calculating that bonus. And it's very easy to overcomplicate that bonus. I've seen some very complicated 1-2 page calculations of how to do a flex. And I guess in all the years I've been doing them, I can't stress enough to make it as simple of a calculation as possible and use actual yield from your farm and use local grain prices. That's what has worked for me. There's 100 ways to write a flex lease, and I like, of course, the way I do it is the way as I think is the best. But there's 100 different ways to do it and many great options. But just keep it simple. In a cash rent lease agreement, the tenant makes all the production decisions and takes the full crop. The landowner receives a basic cash rent, and that rent does not have the ability to slide up if yield or grain markets go up over the year. A good example of a cash versus flex leases was a year ago at this time. You know, last year at this time, the grain markets were depressed, and many farm leases rolled over for 2021. And then during harvest, the market started to rebound and have continued to remain higher. Had we known that before September 1 last year, I think we would have canceled a lot of leases and had a discussion about where rent should go for 2022. On my flex leases that rolled over from 20 to 21, those landowners will likely receive a bonus this end of year after harvest because their flex formula moves with the market. What is important to remember in a cash rent lease is that the tenant, I feel as the tenant has the right to a level of quiet and peaceful enjoyment of that farm. They're taking on all the risk, they're making all the production decisions, and the landowner has to respect that and work out for his or herself what that means on their farm, and have a conversation about that with their tenant. If you want to be more actively engaged in operation decisions past just kind of a basic handful we'll go over in a second, then it's probably a better fit for you to be in a custom farming or crop share agreement. So how do you choose what type of farm lease works best for you? And if I can get to another screen, last week I talked about all these great resources online to just work through the numbers so you can put side by side custom, crop share, flex, and cash. And I wanted to show you what I study, what I pull my numbers from. It's not perfect, it's not specific to each farm, but at least it gives you a perspective and a place to start and a place to at least put your feet while you ask more questions. And so I'm going to figure out, give me a minute. I think I'm going to stop sharing and share again. Something else. So give me a moment, please. Okay. So these are some of the resources that I mentioned last week. And again, none of these are perfect, but the more you can pull together, and compare numbers and have a starting point for conversation, it's just nice to have this outline. So I always look at the estimated costs of production from Iowa State Ag Decision Maker. This is something that is posted online, and if you just Google production costs in Iowa, this probably comes up as one of the first links. So when I'm trying to wrap my head around the numbers for custom farming, I'll pull this up and I'll pull some of these numbers as a reference point, and this publication has multiple options of corn following corn, corn and soybeans, corn silage, and so this is a several page publication, and you can look at it at considering where you are in the state, which average yields are. You can start to get a starting point of, okay, maybe seed, in this budget, maybe seed is $50 an acre. You can pull some very basic numbers for inputs, equipment. It's a starting point for you. This is a real interesting publication. It goes back showing Iowa cash corn and soybean prices from the 20s through current, and they post this, a monthly update. And so here's what's fascinating and why we're talking so much about farm leases this August. We had several years here of an average for the year being in the threes. Our average last year was 348. Our average through June, I think it said, June for 2021 is 529. That's why we're talking about leases. Other input costs are going up, but we are seeing grain prices higher, and it's cause for a discussion. Next publication that I use for numbers to do those side-by-side comparisons is the Iowa State Cash Rental Rate Survey. This is a really interesting tool, and like the others, it shouldn't be used alone. What I always look at and consider is the average number of responses. So for District 1 in Northwest Iowa, Buena Vista County only had 5 responses. And so I would just be weary of if you're in a county with a low response number, maybe it makes more sense for you to look at the district average. So take a look at that and have that be a consideration. But again, a great tool to have a starting point for conversation and for comparing numbers. And then the final one is figure out where, if you're in a cash rent lease, ask where your farmer delivers grain. And it's very easy for you to follow the local prices. For most places across the state, you can find prices online. I work a lot in Indianola. That's Warren County, south of Des Moines. I have a lot of, and I'm not just doing this for Ruth, I happen to go here all the time. A lot of the farmers that I work with in Indianola deliver grain to Heartland and Indianola. So I will pull this up probably once a day, if not every other day, and I'll find Indianola. And this is a reference point for me as I talk to my farmers. This is selling corn today in August, 6/21, fall delivery, October delivery at 5/15. And then I'll look ahead for if you contracted grain today for next year delivery, what's the local price? It's $4.63. So that just gives me a reference point as I try to pull these numbers and do that comparison. So that's a handful of resources just right here on the internet that we can all grab as a point of reference. Okay, so I think I know that there's an easier way to do that. Let's go like this and reshare. So those are some of the online tools that I reference as I do that. Okay, let's see. When you are selecting the right lease for you, also selecting the right tenant, here's just a reminder of when you're looking for a tenant, what I think about, willingness to share, production data, ability to meet and execute the goals of the landowner, and have that shared vision. And I think the other big one for me is the trustworthiness and honesty with any person that I'm working with, not just the farmer, but anybody that I'm doing business with, and also that responsiveness when contacted. Are they willing to take my call? Do we have kind of an open conversation? And again, that's with everyone. That's not just specific to a farmer. Once we have our type of lease set, if I was in a cash rent or flex lease, I would think about considering 1 to 3 to 5 practices to document in a type of addendum with my lease. Just so we can have a roadmap of how we're going to work together. And sometimes it's just nice to have, if we, you make plans in July for the next year, maybe, we'll make a plan of how we're going to pay for cover crops and share that cost, and who's going to reach out to NRCS for cost share. And, just writing that down is a good reminder of like, oh yeah, as a landowner, I said I would call NRCS and sign up for cost share, and I'm going to pay for 50%, and I'm going to pay the invoice, and the farmer's going to reimburse me. Just writing it down so we remember what we made, the plans we made a year ago. If I were to, pick a couple things to put in an addendum, for maybe a common 3 I would pick would be at planting. If I had a farm with waterways, I would ask my tenant to farm through those waterways and not around, helping the water, doing what I can to direct water into the waterways and not alongside. On cover crops, I would, like kind of what we just said, maybe landowner and tenant, we'd agree to pay 50-50 of expenses on seed and application and work together on cost share. Maybe I'd include a line about field borders. I'd ask the tenant to really respect the grass field borders that are already established on the farm or along open drainage ditches, and make sure their spray boom stayed clear of those. And let's see, and I want to revisit this was from workshop 2, just to give us a reminder of this, of when I think about my management cycle on farms, I think of it in 3 parts. I think of it as strategy, setting those building blocks for future decisions. I think about execution, where we're actually doing the boots on the ground and getting those boxes checked. And then for improvement, it's revisiting, those plans and assessing what worked and what can we address, what can we improve moving forward. And in that management cycle, I think of 3 buckets. I think of the farm, environment, and income. And on the farm, it's just beginning with evaluating the full farm's performance, having open communication with that tenant. It's documenting the landowner and tenant roles in that written lease and collecting the operator annual data. And then for improvement, it's reviewing that data, finding ways to layer that information to help with future decision making. On the environment bucket, I would think about familiarizing myself with my local FSA and NRCS offices. I would be very clear about my landowner conservation vision. And going back to what Jean talked about, knowing how my farm sits in the bigger landscape, what's happening above me in the watershed and what's happening as water leaves my farm. On the execution, I would document some of those tasks that I have identified in my conservation vision, include that in a written lease. And then again, going back to that layering data, collecting what information I can to make better decisions. I think early on in one of the sessions, we talked a lot about we don't know what we don't measure. And I always go back to that and think about that. And then on the income side, aligning landowner and tenant goals on revenue And that can go back to what we were just talking about of pulling those numbers for a side-by-side comparison with custom farming, crop share, flex, and cash. Those numbers come in handy in so many conversations and so many uses. It's just a really great tool to understand your tenant's position and your position and how you can work together. For execution, identify cost saving opportunities or cost share opportunities. And then in the improvement, identify the capital improvements that fit into your plan and fit into just where you can get the best ROI on those investments. And I think that's where I'll stop and we can move into our next piece here.
Fantastic. Thanks, Molly. So now we are going to transition into the role-playing segment of today's workshop. So I'll invite Ruth, Molly, and Jean to all unmute, and we'll take about like 10 to 15 minutes to do this, and that way it'll still give us plenty of time for more questions, and we can dive into all the great questions that have been submitted in the chat box today. So yes, why don't the three of you go ahead?
So
Awesome.
I have some questions that I think our farmer, Ruth, needs to answer. And Molly is going to be the what's running in the back of Ruth's mind that Ruth might not be saying. It's just kind of like, whoa, how does this all work? So it's just kind of a way of making transparent what some of the thinking and the decisions that might have to go into that. So I'm just going to launch right in here. I want to have some of that rotational grazing with cattle. And I know we need fencing and water and, you know, for the livestock that we're going to buy. And I'd like to do that next year because I've got income this year to offset the investment for fencing and watering. So I've already thought about that.
Okay. And so I'm going to answer this from two perspectives. The first perspective is the farmer that doesn't have livestock. So, and then the other perspective is the farmer that has livestock, right? So from the first perspective, I don't have any livestock. What? That's nice, Jean. That's great. I don't have any cows. Where, you know, I don't have, where are you going to get the animals for this? And then Molly, I'll just go to the second answer, which is if I have livestock, then you run into a lot more questions, right? But this can still apply to that first scenario if you don't have livestock, which brings us right into, okay, well, where I pasture my cows, they're 10 miles down the road or they're 20 miles down the road. I can't get my cows over here, and I don't have an appropriate trailer to get them over here. I don't have a way to get them, you know, onto the land, and that's going to take a lot of time to manage that. I don't have the time to do this rotational grazing thing. You know, that's crazy. And how about what species? You know, are you wanting to cover crop? Like, what are they going to graze? I just have cash crops in that field.
I want some little Oreo cows.
Only the Oreo cows. Anyway, so those are some of the questions that I've already heard, actually. You know, like, I don't have the equipment for that. I don't know how to get my cows over there. What is it you're wanting them to graze? I'm a cash cropper. Do you want a cover crop? I don't have anything in there that they can graze, maybe some corn stover or whatever, but, you know, what? I don't have any of this stuff. Molly, your turn.
You know, I would probably have the same questions as the tenant. If the tenant doesn't have cattle, I would approach this as this is like, what a great opportunity to bring another person into our partnership, and asking Jean of, you know, what's your level of comfort with doing some searching in the bigger neighborhood of, can we find somebody that would be a good fit with how you lease your land? So it'd be a good fit with the landowner and a good fit with our our row crop farmer? Can we find somebody that can fit in nicely and everybody can get along? And I'd say, let's explore that. And I'd ask Jean, what kind of role do you want to play in that? You want to take a more active role? And I've worked with landowners that are very active in this stage, and like they'll reach out to Practical Farmers of Iowa, to the Find a Farmer network, and maybe, you know, they do that piece of the matchmaking. That's really cool. If it's, or it's me reaching out to someone I already know in the community, or it's us as a group having that conversation, and through our network of all of us, who do we know that we could add? And then the other red, you know, the flag that would come up was my fear from a liability perspective of fencing and keeping, and where the farm sits. Is it along a highway? You know, just working through the risk piece of it, finding the person that's the right fit, and risk of keeping cattle out of the road would be the first concerns that pop into my head.
And also too, I'll say, when you mentioned the group finding somebody, right? Like, you know, I asked the questions of the most skeptical grower, right? But you're going to talk to some growers who are going to be like, well, I mean, I have a neighbor that has cattle.
Yeah.
Let's talk to the neighbor. Or, well, my son has cattle. Let's bring my son into this. Or I think, you know, I used the most skeptical questions, but.
Absolutely. That's what we wanted you to do, because I'm likely to get pushback if I just come at it that way. I feel pretty confident as a landowner, and here I come, and oh, we need an anger translator, you know. So I have another question before we move to our next part. So I'd like to put a cover crop on that south field because it's hilly and it's eroding. And I think we should do cereal rye because it grows really well and holds the soil with its roots.
So again, coming from the perspective of that farmer all the way to the right on that curve, right, that absolutely doesn't want to do this, because you're going to find a lot of growers are not at this stage of the game. They know what cover crops are, and many are willing to experiment. But from the perspective of the person that doesn't want to do it, I don't have the right equipment. I can't. What am I supposed to do in the spring? How am I supposed to terminate those cover crops? That's expensive. The seed is expensive. Cover crop seed is expensive. I'm not a no-tiller, so I don't have no-till equipment. So in the spring, how am I supposed to plant into all that biomass after I terminate it? And you know, putting on in the fall, you know, with something that winter kills like oats, well, that's not even worth it. And it's expensive to fly that stuff on. And of course I would have to fly that seed on because I can't get in there before I harvest. And so it's going to be expensive to aerial apply that seed. You know, I don't want it to mess with my cash crop next year. If I put down something like rye, it's gonna mess with my corn in the spring. And I don't want to deal with that. I don't want to deal with bugs and disease that might come from that cover crop. So, you know, I'm no.
Darn.
I'm trying to find some more, but.
When I talk with landowners and tenants, I acknowledge that getting consistent field conditions in the spring and in the fall are important. And I acknowledge with the tenant that it's critical for when the window of weather is cooperating, they want to run and they want to run hard, and they can't, if you're working with a farmer with a lot of acres, they can't stop for variability. And so I acknowledge that. I acknowledge that this is a new, adding something new that could create a variability compared to all their other acres. And I think about, I think about what role the landowner can play of, can the landowner take over responsibility of seeking crop share? Can they, that paperwork, just any paperwork for anything is a hassle. Nobody wants to do the paperwork and do the follow-up. It's not fun. So can we take that for the farmer and take over that responsibility and follow up as needed and line up the pieces? That would be often an argument that, arguing point that is easy for the landowner. And then doing some sort of scale of landowner paying some 50%, maybe they pay for all at the beginning and then it scales back over the years. I had another point and I forgot. Maybe we'll talk and I'll catch it. And then also starting simple. If we have 500 acres, maybe there is, a backfield that is HEL, more erodible. Can we start there? Can we start with a smaller piece to try? Also, can we address the corn and rye concern that most tenants will have? Can we practice first with going to soybeans? Can we try that for a first year? Can we pick a farm that's in corn that's going to soybeans and do an overwinter cover crop and just see how it goes and learn and make, start small and how can we build up?
Cool.
Yeah, and I just want to add to that too, from the agronomist perspective. Yes, absolutely. Look into your options for cost share. Look into private cost share programs. Like, it's not just the farmer that can apply for cost share. You can too. You're the landowner. You can't get the same cost share on the same acres, but actually I know a lot of tenant-landowner relationships where the tenant takes cost share on one set of acres and the landowner takes cost share on another set of acres. Thereby, they're both able to take advantage of some cost share for the same practice. And so, you can definitely communicate about that with your tenants. And there are a lot of first-time cover crop programs that pay a decent amount. Practical Farmers has a fantastic first-time program, $40 per acre for up to 40 acres. That's a lot. And then state cost share is $25 per acre. And yes, you can stack those. So now you're looking at, for a first-timer for 40 acres, you're looking at $65 an acre. So that's nothing to sneeze at. That will definitely cover the cost of the seed and the application and the general pain in the ass factor that some farmers might be concerned about. So you can definitely look into those options as well.
And it doesn't get enough, that I don't hear farmers talking enough about, is that cover crop insurance. I mean, my understanding is that's pretty easy to sign up for, and it's all online, and not enough farmers are taking advantage of that. My experience, and that's through IDOLs.
Yeah, it's funny. I think a lot of the growers that I work with who are adopting conservation practices, you would be amazed at how many don't use state or federal funding or private funding, usually because they just didn't know about it. And that it blows my mind every time I talk to somebody that they don't know about the cost share that's available. That blows my mind, but I swear it is a thing. The struggle is real. So I think we should probably move into the answering some questions. And then after we've answered some of the questions in the chat, then we can just go right into like a discussion. And I want to say that in this call, we have some other experts that are in this call. And there's Carol Smith, who's from the Women, Land, and Legacy group. There's Courtney Myers, who's a district conservationist with the NRCS. I know that there are some folks on this call from IDALS as well. IDALS being the Iowa Department of Ag and Land Stewardship. Obviously, there's people here from Practical Farmers, et cetera. So those folks might not pipe up and say anything, but they are here. And if they hear a question, if any of you have a question that would be geared towards maybe somebody in the NRCS or somebody at IDALS, or maybe somebody from the Women, Land, and Legacy, if you have a question like that, feel free to ask it, either unmute yourself or put it in the chat box, and one of those people can pipe up and give an answer on behalf of their organization. So we're not expecting them to say anything, but they might pipe up and answer as well.
Well, and the three of you got some verbal applause from Chris in the chat there. So job well done on your role playing.